Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Sasha Beatty, and I am Senior Counsel at the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, or APA. APA is a private nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., serving prosecutors as well as their law enforcement and community partners. Thank you for joining this capital litigation webinar today. This project is supported by grant number 15 PBJ A22 GK 03018 CAPL, awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance through the Office of Justice Programs. APA is very appreciative of their financial assistance and commitment to improving the justice system. Points of view or opinions in this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice or the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. Just some quick housekeeping before we start with introductions. If you have a question for either or both of our presenters today, please use the Q&A widget, which is typically at the bottom of your screen. We will be holding questions until the end of the presentation, so about 5-10 minutes out from the top of the hour, at which time our presenters will address them. And if you are having any technical issues or you have any questions, audio or video concerns, please use the chat box, which is typically found at the bottom of your screen, and just let us know and one of us will assist you. Additionally, today our speakers will be sharing some useful tools for you, which you will find in the chat box, and they'll discuss them a little bit. There's going to be a link to a resource guide provided by the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center, for example, that we will include in the chat box for you, and also on our webpage at the end of the day. Finally, after the webinar, you will be asked to complete a 1-minute post-webinar survey so that we can continue to provide you with relevant and timely webinar trainings for you in your offices. Please use that to let us know what's useful and how we can improve so that we can give you quality programming. Now, today, it is my pleasure to welcome our presenters from the Arizona Crime Victim Rights Law Group. First, we have Dan Levy, who serves as a victim advocate and executive director for the Arizona Crime Victim Rights Law Group. Dan has previously served as the executive director of the National Organization of Parents of Murdered Children, Inc. Dan previously served as the Office of Victim Services Director at the Office of Arizona Attorney General and as the advisor for victims to Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano. Dan has been a dedicated advocate for victims' rights since 1996 when his brother Howard was murdered. Dan's focus has been to change and improve public policy concerning the treatment of crime victims and their families, and he has been involved in crafting numerous pieces of victim rights legislation. We're also joined by Colleen Hendricks, who serves as a victim advocate at the Arizona Crime Victim Rights Law Group and has extensive experience in victim advocacy, training, and crisis response services. Previously, she worked for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, Victim Services Division, as a major crimes advocate, providing direct services for and with victims of crime. Over her career, Colleen has been awarded a Certificate of Appreciation from the U.S. DOJ, Flagstaff Arizona's Athena Award, and the Arizona Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award for her dedication to the profession. She graduated from Northern Arizona University with a master's in applied sociology and a master's in education and community college education in '93. So thank you both so much for being here and for sharing your expertise today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sasha, and good afternoon to everybody. We're glad you're here, and hopefully we can provide you some good and important information, and I'm honored to be joined by my colleague, Colleen Hendricks, and I had the opportunity to work with Colleen for many years, and I think what we'll be able to show you today is some of our experiences or stuff that we've learned on mass violence and prosecutors and victimization. Just real quick, Colleen, please jump in. Our agenda and what is a mass violence. Interesting enough, there's many different definitions out there. We'll just briefly go through a few because I think it is part of the landscape, because it is sort of a moving definition. Briefly go over some mass violence stats, considerations when mass violence events or tragedies occur. I mean, I call them terrorist attacks, but when they occur, oftentimes they're high profile, and as we'll talk later, with the high propensity of how often they're happening, it's not as often that they're getting media coverage or any coverage. And just tips on model practices and working with victims of mass violence from a prosecutor and a victim advocate or a paralegal or anybody that's working on a capital case team with crime victims. You're all an important part of that network. And then we'll finish up with some resources that hopefully your community won't need in a situation where mass violence tragedy occurs. Term mass violence means killing 3 or more killings in a single incident that occur in a public place. And that's from the Investigative Assistance for Violent Crime Act of 2012. So there it's saying mass killings means 3 or more killings in a single incident that occur in a public place. So obviously, domestic violence type crimes in a home and that sort of thing are not covered. The Federal Bureau of Investigation doesn't have a mass shooting definition. Instead, the FBI defines mass murder as an incident where 4 or more people are killed, which can include gun violence. So you're seeing a little bit of the definitions different. And this group, the Gun Violence Archive, which is a nonprofit research group, defines a mass shooting as an incident in which 4 or more people are shot or killed, not including the shooter. And oftentimes, when statistics are given out, sometimes the shooter's included. It depends. I've seen it both ways. Certainly not referring to the shooter as a victim, but sometimes that's the total number of people that were killed, whether it's law enforcement or suicide. Every town, USA currently defines a mass shooting as a shooting in which 4 or more people are shot and killed, and here again, excluding the shooter. And then active shooter, which is got its own definition. The FBI defines an active shooter as 1 or more individuals actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. So that's obviously active shooter with a gun. For the period of 2017 to 2021, active shooter incident data reveals an upward trend. The number of active shooters, and you'll see here, incidents identified in 2021 represents a 52% increase from 2020 and a 96.8% increase from 2017. So as we all know and see, active shooters are not that uncommon anymore. A breakdown of the number of incidents within the 5-year period from 2017 through 2021. Here you'll see, active shooters 31, and then in 2018 they went to 30, 2019 30, 2020 40, 2021, which was last year they had the data, went up to 61. Mass violence stats, 2,924 victims. It's just unimaginable. And those are the people that are victims of the crime. And we know the ripple effect of how many people in the community, how many first responders, although they may not be classified as victims. I've responded to mass violence events, and there's community resource centers, and prosecutors and advocates work closely with those resiliency centers and resource centers. And it's not always just direct. Sometimes it's witnesses as well. And it's really important to make sure that those services are there. But this sort of puts it, in a statistic, 400 mass shootings in 2023. And that's as of Monday, July 21st, sorry. So their stats are what they are. We wanted to include those just as sort of a backdrop of what we're talking about. Many jurisdictions, thank God, haven't had to deal with a mass violence event. Others have. And in my experience and in talking to others, and Colleen may have thoughts, every community sort of responds differently. I mean, the law is the law, and obviously prosecutors are going to, charge the case they can. But I think that in mass violence incidents, there's so many dynamics, especially like cultural issues, working with the mass violence victims from, the El Paso shooting at Walmart was different than working with the victims in Buffalo from the mass shooting at the supermarket there. And because there's cultural differences, and that plays into it sometimes.
Let me add a little something here.
Please.
One of the things that I have always found a dilemma is that we come from a society historically, and I am probably older than most of you, in that violence happened to somebody else. We're in a society now that we need to plan for violence. That's not inviting it. It's being prepared for it, because we have small towns that have been subjected to this mass violence. We have big cities who have been subjected. Everyone handles it differently, but they all have to handle it, a lot of it locally. And prosecutors have kind of been on the edge of that. And yet they're very, very much an integral component in the resilience of those victims and the resilience of that community. And so for me, we need to put some emphasis on both the prosecution and in prosecutor resilience. Okay, you're up, Dad.
Have mass shootings become so common that we are numb to them? And I ask myself that question, and I want to say, yeah. I mean, I wish I didn't say that, but they are so common. I mean, it's still, because I work in this field, and you probably all as well, I'm noticing them all when they do occur, but they just seem like it's become so common. It's still obviously huge and traumatic, and it doesn't take away anything, but I just think it's sort of how society is becoming. Mass violence cases often, not every time, but often, are high profile. And so obviously there's considerations with prosecutors, victim advocates, and survivors and victims. I use that term interchangeably, and dealing with the local, national, and sometimes even international media. And so prosecutors' offices typically have, a media plan, a PIO, some type of plan in place, when tragedy strikes of a mass violence magnitude, or if they don't, they should have some sort of media plan to deal with that, because it can be overwhelming. And then for the victims and survivors, obviously, whether they should talk to the media, or some may without your consent, without first going through the prosecution, and all the dynamics that could bring. People want to share their stories of their loved ones, and they're dealing with trauma. Some may want and not say anything to the media, which you probably already know with cases you've had. There's always, in my experience, I can't say always, but in my experience, there's always a press conference. I say always because I've always seen this, where the elected prosecutor and other officials, mayor, police chief, governor, will get together and give a press briefing. Obviously, the more you can communicate with the victims about what's going to be said, and if it's an ongoing investigation and the police are looking for the shooter, there may not be a whole lot that the prosecutor says at that point. I don't know, but certainly if somebody's been apprehended, and the information that's going to be given out shouldn't be found out by a victim or survivor in the media. first. They should have an insight to that. Sometimes victim advocates respond to the scene with crisis workers, as do prosecutors. I know prosecutors often go to the scene of homicides. And I put this in there because, I think it's so important that we take care of ourselves as well. And through the vicarious trauma of helping others, it's important that we take care of ourselves, all of us. I'm not preaching, but I'm getting up there in age as well. And I know how important that can be. And over the years, it does affect you. And I know from prosecutors that they try oftentimes, not to build real super close relationships, obviously professional, but because they've got to try the case. And I do understand that, but I do know that, you can have a good bedside manner and treat people with fairness, respect, and dignity, no matter the situation. So I just put this in there because, you're there from the beginning oftentimes, or crisis workers. There's the prosecutor, and then the initial interaction with victims. I've seen it where the prosecutors met with victims and law enforcement, in a room. I mean, that's really, right after the scene. But in the weeks and months, certainly meeting in person with victims, even if there's a lot in the Las Vegas shooting or other shootings, sometimes there's hundreds of victims. And it's certainly a challenging job. But certainly, I always find that it helps to make a better witness and just a better experience, if you will, if the prosecutor is open and communicating. And then finding the perpetrator alive or dead and the considerations that come in with that. And if somebody's missing, or, usually I don't think they're always caught right away. Sometimes they are, but whether they're alive or dead, and considerations and, the death penalty and, what happens with that, and just all the stuff that goes into, first, is he going to be given life, or is he going to be given she or he, depending on the situation? And I think I have a slide in there here about that. And the community and victims and survivors asking questions on why, why did this happen in our community, demanding justice from the prosecutors, other messages that may get out that may not be true, that could be developed by media or community groups or activists who are understandably angry and they want to blame and take it out on somebody. And so, that's extremely important, and that the community has good relationship with prosecutors to the extent.
Let me add one tiny little thing here, and it's just a thought-provoking. I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question. When a defendant, a mass murderer, commits suicide or suicide by cop, we all know that technically, according to the Constitution, he's not convicted of that crime. I want you to think about the importance of a loved one hearing that from someone who understands law versus learning in your children learning it in school, or hearing it from a neighbor. That's really tough information. So it's something that, there's no right way with that information. But I do want you to muse over the importance of being able to provide that information, because they're going to get it from the media and or someone else. And it's important to get it from someone they would like to trust. Okay, Dan.
Good points. Reactions, we all react differently as we talked about earlier, some people are numb to it now. I've worked with victims in mass violence, victim survivors, and they all do react differently. Some people, as you know, as prosecutors and professionals in the criminal justice system, advocates, paralegal, whoever, people react differently after any trauma. And certainly mass violence is, considered traumatic, and people, wake up one day, they go to a supermarket or they go to work and they never come home, and how those family members in the aftermath respond is often, not always, but sometimes how they're treated throughout the criminal justice system. And I've worked with some survivors who, initially just had it all together. I'm sure Colleen has, and they're advocating and running with blinders, and they're taking care of funeral arrangements. They're taking care of the family. They're out there being the advocate and helping and doing what they can. And then, and I'm not saying they'll always be like that, but then there's other people who just can't get up out of bed every day, let alone, go to a court hearing or be involved in the criminal justice system. And so, it's just, I wish there was, a magic pill to make it all go away. But in my experience in 27 years, including my own brother's homicide, I saw it in my own family. It wasn't a mass violence homicide, but it was a random act of violence. And, some people never talk to a therapist. Some people do. So I guess, and the prosecutors, I'm sure, react differently to mass violence events, perhaps, than other crimes. I don't know. That's kind of a question I would ask all of you. These reactions may be experienced by victims who were directly affected by the incident, obviously, and directly affected, although they may not be part of the criminal prosecution. Typically, if you were there and witnessed it, you're considered, a crime victim. If you were there and imminent death was right there in front of you, at least most compensation programs that I've worked with would allow that person to be considered a victim. I can't say all of them. And so those people who were injured, people who were directly affected by it, and sometimes people say, well, I saw it on the news, I was directly affected. Obviously, that's not what we're talking about. Family, friends, and others who are closely associated, employers. And I've, just as background, some of the mass violence events I've worked with, I have been at employers, FedEx in Indianapolis, several banks, and it affects the entire organization from the top down. And they work closely with prosecutors and law enforcement, obviously, in turning over video and film. So employers, I think it's important that the employer offer, it's not really the prosecutors, bailiwick, but it's nice to know that, are you guys providing, or someone providing, community assistance for these folks? And as I said, people who witness or heard details about the incident may have reactions as well.
And all someone needs to think about is, where were you on 9/11? Because most of us clearly remember that. For me, the first was, where was I when JFK was killed? We remember that. When John Kennedy was killed, I literally was stuck in front of a television for 4 days. I was just starting high school, and I remember the trauma was so tremendous that I wasn't even at my own house, but I could not function. So sometimes it's about us. It's about how our history is affected by prior experience, now traumatized by this new event. And we have to take that into consideration for ourselves, so that we aren't re-victimized by what is in front of us.
Now, that's important. And I think back, even, Sandy Hook or Uvalde, or, children, and I mean, they're all bad, but you start to sort of mark, well, is that now in the background of the conscious of the, of the community or the country? I don't know. But I know mass violence events seem to get a lot of attention. One thing that happens a lot is communities do respond or preparedness for a mass violence event. And I would think that would include, the prosecutor's office. And so if you don't have one, emergency management in your community, or should organize one that when something does happen, you can flip a switch and have at least some, processes in place. It's essential for prosecutors to get a sense. I'm going to move this here. It's essential for prosecutors to get a sense of the comprehensive reactions to the mass violence incident, from victims and the community's anger to media inquiries to some victim survivors not wanting to cooperate or feelings of revenge. Emotions can run the gauntlet. And as we talked about, I mean, some victims, they want to forgive, perpetrators. And what I've learned over my career is, as we've said before, everyone deals with it different. And, I just approach my work with, as long as you're doing something that's, not criminal and it's ethical, then everyone deals with trauma so different. And here's some model practices to consider when working with mass violence victims. And I mean, some of this is probably not new, or maybe it is, but it's certainly stuff that applies really with all crime victims. Securing, along with law enforcement, the appropriate interviews, ensure survivors and victims are treated with dignity and respect throughout the criminal justice system. I know most states have victims' rights, Bill of Rights in their constitutions, or certainly in statutes. And so these words, dignity and respect, throughout the criminal justice system, aren't just words written on pieces of paper. It means a lot. And I mean, that's pretty up to somebody, I guess, whether I'm treated with dignity and respect, but I always use it as, how would you like to be treated? It's simple. Even if you can't charge first-degree murder, or it's not the death penalty and the families want it, the majority, or whatever the situation is, treating them with dignity and respect. And I understand that that doesn't mean survivors or victims will always treat you with dignity and respect, but I hope they would. And just appreciate knowing, you're being honest and telling the information as it is. And the same on the flip side. Hey, we're going for capital punishment, we're going for first-degree murder, whatever the case may be. Understanding everyone has different backgrounds and deals with trauma differently, as Colleen aptly pointed out, and that's really true. And I, mentioned it before, and I was recently, there were 2 mass violence events in Louisville, and one happened in a urban, brown, Black community, and the other happened at a bank, and one happened at a park in this urban community. And, I mean, and they didn't catch the perpetrator yet, but there's different communities, and, how they're treated is so important. And who better than the people that live in those communities, to know what the cultural differences are, or any other differences. And ensure.
And the thing is,
Yep.
Ask before you offend. Ask. One of the things I discovered, for instance, I worked extensively with the Navajo people. I lived on the reservation, and I would tell them, I don't want to offend you, so please tell me if I say something wrong, so I can say what I need to differently. I do not want to offend you. Culture is who you come from. That's a big deal. So be cautious. Make sure, if you don't know, tell them, I've never worked with someone from India. I've never worked with someone from Nigeria. I've never, please help me understand your culture so that we can have a good communicative relationship. That in itself is demonstrating respect, and they will never forget that you put that out front. And they are, I'm amazing how forgiving they are when you screw up, because they can see that you're trying to do it differently, and they're very, very forgiving. Again, because you were respectful in asking. And don't be afraid to do that.
That's great advice. Yeah, I can't second that enough. And I mean, we're all human beings. People say things, people react differently, as we've pointed out here, but I can't agree more with that. You know, asking them is awesome. And I think ensuring the victim advocates are engaged with the families and victims. Sometimes I hear from victims, you know, and everyone's busy, but we need to make sure that, you know, the advocates are fully engaged in providing notifications and updates and meetings as they occur, and things you already do, I'm sure. But as a victim advocate, I always hammer that home as well. Don't forget and use the advocates. And then this is another one. Sometimes we've run into this, not with the mass violence, but I know this has come up. Helping victims get their property back, such as cars, cell phones, keys. I know, like, and that's maybe more of a law enforcement, but if the case goes forward and evidence is, you know, not needed anymore, we've been able to go to court and actually get a court order to have law enforcement or the prosecutor, whoever, release whatever, the heirloom watch that had nothing to do with it. So just something to keep in mind, because people, obviously, heirlooms or even a t-shirt or something that reminds them, you know, of their loved one, for many, that's very important. Help victims understand their constitutional and statutory victims' rights under the law. That's what we do here at our little nonprofit in Arizona. And I know we work closely with prosecutors around the state, and they do a great job of making sure victims are informed. And I'm sure in your jurisdictions you do as well. It's important for victims because it doesn't mean, obviously, that they're, you know, a party to the case, but they do have standing. And so sometimes, and what we have, our victims' rights attorney, Randy Udelman, is awesome. He can go to court and work typically with the prosecutors, and he's able to go in front of that little bar where the lawyers get to go, and in the bench conferences, up to bench conferences or meetings in chambers, or just, I mean, it allows the victim to have a voice and be present. It's not necessary, obviously, but sometimes it helps to have a victim's rights attorney. And as I said, these aren't just words written on paper. You usually found out about your rights, if you did, at the worst time of your life, when law enforcement maybe hands you a brochure and says, hey, you have rights. And so it really takes a team effort from a crisis worker to a victim advocate to law enforcement to the prosecutor's office to make sure victims are aware. And sometimes their rights may conflict with the state. And at least here in Arizona, victims have, like I said, standing to say, you know, I don't like this plea deal, Your Honor. Most of the time, the court says thank you and, you know, does agree with the plea deal, but sometimes they don't. We recently had a case where the judge said, I can't in good conscience accept this plea, and basically state, go redo it, state and defense. And so, and the victims gave their statement why they were opposed to it. Victim privacy statutes and how they deal with the defense counsel and the media. This is important. I know that sometimes, you know, defense counsel or their agents, or I've heard of stories here in Arizona and other places where, you know, and obviously I'm not painting every defense person bad, but we've had investigators on some occasions say, hey, I'm from the state, not making it clear that they're from the defense counsel until the victim begins to talk. And there's actually a court of appeals case That's up at the Ninth Circuit. A little sidebar on whether defense counsel can contact victims without going through the prosecutor. Since 1990, we've had victims' rights that basically, I think 91 was when the legislation got implemented, but basically said, the victim can turn down a defense interview or deposition from the defense attorney, the defendant himself, defense investigator, whoever. They have to go through the prosecutor. So now that's kind of in flux, and we'll see. And obviously the media just showing up. I'd like to think media is doing and gotten much better over the years in respecting and privacy of victims, and not just showing up on someone's door or filming a body laying in the street or stuff like that. Prepare for victims for court proceedings, including evidentiary hearings, trial, or other proceedings where specific graphic photos may be shown. Colleen's very good at this, working with victims and families, not only in this, but in many areas. And you could speak to it, Colleen, but we've,
Yeah, here's what I will tell you. I have had enough experience with the most horrific of photos and having victims say, "Thank you for letting me see this," that I am firmly committed in my belief that a victim has a right to choose. Our responsibility is to help them to understand how difficult the photos are, but also to give them an opportunity, should they just determine if they can see them in advance. That can be really important, spending a few moments with them, either a prosecutor, and sometimes I like that best, with an advocate in attendance. One, because the sense of ownership, that sounds like a strange word, that goes with the case, feels like protection when a prosecutor tells them about a photo. When an advocate, it's a kindness. When a prosecutor does, it is looked at somehow differently. And I can't stress enough what an amazing position that puts the prosecutor in to help this victim deal with what they're seeing. Many victims say, "I'll let you know when I'm seeing it." So I've rushed more than one victim out of the room, but they have a right. We don't have a right to tell them they can't do something. They really need the facts. They can far better deal with truth than they can down the road deal with the fact information was withheld.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, and we've seen, and oftentimes the prosecutor will let the court know that there's going to be some graphic photos. We'd like to pause and let the victims know. And we've even had a TV in the victim waiting room that shows the court that we put a blanket over it so the victims in the room couldn't see it. They didn't want to see the graphic autopsy photos. So
yeah, just set it up best you can for what their wishes are. And I've had them say they wanted to be protected and then last minute said, "Nope, I'm coming in." So we just warn them in advance, and there we go.
All right.
Okay,
I don't know why this is not moving forward.
there you go.
Explain the potential for a lengthy criminal justice process. I think
Whoa.
that's so important for the prosecutor to do that and the advocates, but hearing it from a prosecutor, I mean, prosecutor is an intimidating person. You guys may not know it, but for some people, I'd say for a lot, you're intimidating, not because of who you are, but just the position, not saying personally, but dealing with judges, lawyers, prosecutors, defense attorneys. So I think explaining the potential for a lengthy criminal justice process, obviously we don't know, but if it's a capital murder case in your jurisdiction, setting it up front and explaining them, this is the process.
At the same time, what I have found as one of the most successful tools is a diagram. I'm sure you have a diagram of the system in your office. Print those babies up. Because when you can explain the process and say, this could take 2 years, 3 years. We've seen it take 5. That's pretty realistic. And they can see the process. Their mind is better able to absorb that information because they have a visual, which is 80% of us, and they have an auditory. So you're explaining and demonstrating, and let them have the copy. Let them put notes on it, give it to them. Another thing is make sure you explain appeals. For goodness sakes, explain appeals. When they look at that diagram and it says appeals and you've got a capital case, they're not going to like hearing you say, and I will tell victims, you're not going to always like what I tell you. I will never lie to you.
Yeah.
And an appeal can go on forever.
Yeah, and I don't think, I think sometimes, people want to protect others, so maybe they don't say something or show them, a picture, but I think it should be left up to victims, as far as that goes. And I can give one little brief story as we've been talking about, honesty and just, in capital cases being, frank, even if it's not good news. And in my brother's case, which was a homicide, that was a capital murder case, and about 2 years into it, the prosecutor said, and he had been on there, can I meet with you and your dad for a cup of coffee? And so we met, and he said, I've come to the resolution that I no longer ethically believe in the death penalty, and thus I can't be your prosecutor. And of course, we were like, at first, devastated, because we're like, now what? Now we get somebody new, and this guy we liked. And but at the end of the day, and I told him this, we were thankful that he had the ethical, and moral ability to say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And so that's just a story that it still resonates with me 26 years later. Ensure victims know about state victim compensation programs, especially advocates and prosecutors. I mean, can't tell you the number of victims in mass violence as well that didn't know about victim compensation. Didn't think, they had the wherewithal to apply for it even. And so that's just important. It's there. Oftentimes, and I'll talk about it here in a minute, but oftentimes when these things happen, millions of dollars pour in for, funds to help and assist the victims. I'll talk about that in a second, but ensure community leaders and victim advocates know the Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime, Mass Violence, Anti-Terrorism, and Emergency Assistance Program. I should have just said AAP, but they provide to communities based on that definition we went over earlier, funding to come in and help set up a resource center in the community so that there is continuing counseling and services for the victims. Not only I've seen it in Pulse nightclub and other communities where, these agencies or resiliency centers are called, stay in the community long after, the event, and they help other victims and provide resources in the community. So, and that's money that's there. I was talking with the Office of Victims of Crime director recently at a conference, and she's like, yeah, communities should just reach out and the money will be there. I mean, it takes a little bit, but Victims First is a network of surviving victims of mass casualty, a good organization that is survivor-based. These are actual victims who have been victims of mass casualty crimes or mass violent crimes. And so it sometimes helped to have that peer-to-peer support. And as I was mentioning before, and this is where I've done some work on the side of my full-time job of donor management, of working with the National Compassion Fund. There's other organizations as well, but it's a nonprofit that's part of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And what happens is, millions of dollars pour into a community sometimes. And so some governor, some mayor, somebody says, we need somebody to administer these funds to make sure 100% of it goes to the victims, and every penny that's donated of the donor intent goes to the victims. And so National Compassion Fund and others set up, a way to distribute that money. It started after the movie theater shooting in Colorado, where people were shot and their loved ones, it was in Aurora, loved ones died in their arms, and they weren't eligible for funds in that community because that fund only recognized those that were killed and those that were injured. And so the Compassion Fund and other organizations now recognize, the trauma of witnessing, and so they're eligible for a lower award, if you will. But it's very important, and that should be part of an emergency plan in communities. That what are we going to do? Who's going to distribute this money? Typically a local steering committee of community leaders is put together, and they help manage it. So it's just an area not necessarily right up to prosecutors, but it's certainly something that comes up. Mass Violence Victim Resource Center, we mentioned them earlier, another good resource for mass violence information. And then one thing I've seen in responding to mass violence events is, having affordable counseling in the community, free, preferably, and that there be an agency that can help do that and get funding to provide that counseling to the victims at no cost, because so many people are affected by mass violence tragedies that it goes beyond not only the immediate family members, but cousins, other people as well. Obviously, they may not, always be considered a legal crime victim, but they certainly were traumatized generally. And as I mentioned, these resiliency centers, there's one in El Paso, the Pulse nightclub, Las Vegas. Sometimes they close down after a while because the funding, it has to be sustained eventually. And community resources and partners. And that's so important to have that in place, even before something happens. And, we do shooter active drills with law enforcement and special locks at schools and prepare. But what we don't always prepare for are, the aftermath of who's going to help these people and what's in place. And do we have a plan to help? And so I think a prosecutor, elected DA, would have an interest in being one of those partners.
Okay, Dan, I'd like to jump in a second.
Sure.
One of the things that's really important, we tend to put this energy into our community planning, and heaven knows that's absolutely necessary. In all likelihood, your attorney general serves on your community team, your city prosecutor, your county prosecutor. Lots of those people serve on a team. What's going on in your agency? That's where I'm going to put my concern right there for the moment. If there was a mass shooting, if you're in a rural area, you may have prosecutors that every prosecutor works any case. In a big city, you're going to have prosecutors, you'll have a homicide or a capital litigation bureau. You'll have a sex crimes bureau. You break them out. In a mass shooting, it's not just about it could be 10 defendants, could be one defendant, but you're working with 100 victims. How are you going to work within your agency? You have to be able to discuss that, to plan it, to figure out, besides your county attorney or your state attorney, is there someone else who can also do media coverage? Is there someone who can oversee advocacy? Because there are going to be lots of additional advocacy responsibilities. And everybody already had a caseload. So how are you going to disperse present caseloads to work on your big caseload into something that is workable now that you have 100 families you're working with? You have to be able to put yourself in that mindset of, let's plan this. If you're working with a bureau that is well-experienced homicide attorneys, I don't want you to, I love it when people tell me, oh, they've handled the worst of the worst. In my mind, what I say is, are they jaded? Have they become absolutely, they're the knight with their armor? Or are they now more vulnerable because they have 100 families in this caseload? The whole issue about vicarious victimization. I've done this 42 years. I say in the morning, please let me be the best I can be, and at night, I say, thank you for allowing me to be the best with the tools I was given. Or I couldn't do this job because I see some ugly, ugly, ugly things. And I've had my own private life in the meantime, which is what you all need to be remembered. You have that private life, you have those children. Your job does come home with you. Vicarious victimization, when you're depressed and you don't know why, you're tired, you're not thinking as clearly, you just want a break. All of a sudden, someone's irritating the heck out of you, and you can't put your finger on what's going on. I had a judge teach me a really, really important lesson. I was fortunate to work the first DNA case in Arizona. Horrible case. A 9-year-old child was sexually assaulted, brutalized, and murdered. The judge was an amazing judge. I had great respect for him going in. And jury did a guilty verdict, tiniest piece of DNA, and they still made it work. A couple months later, he asked me to come to his law class and present on victimology. Now, I'm telling you, this man was such a good judge, and he was quite stoic, very controlled, knew law, profound knowledge. And I walked in his class, and he started to introduce me and started crying, sobbing. And I told his class, I need you to step outside for 10 to 15 minutes. I will come get you. I promise I will come get you, so don't leave. And I did about a 12-minute crisis intervention. And what I learned was that he had worked all these years to to demonstrate his strength, to be his very best. But this case had affected him so deeply. And I was sorry, not sorry it was me that this happened with. One, I respected him so much. But the point is, you have to take care of you first. Remember the plane and the oxygen. Unless you're taking care of yourself, you cannot be your best at anything else.
And we are
Don't
at
let-
5 minutes to the top of the hour, Colleen and Dan, just so you know.
Thank you.
Okay. I just want you to remember the importance of caring for yourself. That that's not a weakness.
No, and I always
That-
say, you know, it's just like my car, you know, I bring it in for a tune-up every now and then. And so I'm not saying everybody needs a therapist or go, but find something that, you know, will help you with potential vicarious trauma. I know, you know, many, like especially law enforcement, my neighbors in law enforcement, I know many, you know, and they, you know, have shot their guns or even maybe killed somebody. And it's like, have you talked to anybody? And it's like, yeah, I went to the, you know, shrink for a couple of days. And, but, you know, they can't say, hey, I went for help, or I do want to talk to somebody, not that I have PTSD or anything, just I'm a human and I saw some bad stuff and you guys see that bad stuff. And so, you know, make sure you're taking care of yourself.
And I want to tell you on that case, never did an appeal go. I mean, everything was denied for this person and he was executed in 2011. So I honor, and this judge has passed away. So I honor those that can hang in there, but I want you to also take care of you while you're hanging in there.
Just some final thoughts. There's no one definition of mass violence. There's many varying dynamics. We must all work together to ensure that victims of mass violence, crime, and all crime are treated with dignity and respect, and that justice is sought. And I know justice means something different to everybody, but whatever that is, I hope people get. In working with victims and survivors of mass violence crimes, it truly takes community, state, and our nation to ensure victims' voices are heard, and community resource partners again. Here's our contact information. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And again, there's something in the chat box about the link to Community Court Planning Guide from the National Mass Violence Resource Center.
And I can't say enough about the information you will find on that site. It is absolutely amazing. Take it home to your family, give it to your wife, give it to your husband. You have kids in college, give them the information. Honest to goodness, I spent a couple of hours in that resource last night, just checking out exactly what it was. And I know a few of the people who are part of that wonderful agency. And I cannot stress enough how helpful it will be. Give it to your schools, let them know about it.
They have some great research as well, you know, that they've come up with on mass violence, and it is a resource center.
It's wonderful.
Well, that completes our presentation, unless anybody has the last second question.
And at this time, if anybody has any questions for our presenters, you can use the Q&A function and or the chat box to ask our presenters anything about what they touched on. And in the meantime, I'll just point out that this webinar is going to be recorded. We are going to put it on our official website as well as our YouTube channel. So if you or somebody else within your office feels that this is a good training and you'd like to rewatch it, you can find that online in just a few short days. I'm not seeing anyone in the chat box or any questions that our attendees have for our presenters. So I'd just like to say, Colleen and Dan, thank you so much for your time and just breaking that down for us today. Sincerely appreciate you sharing your thoughts and your resources. I know that this is going to be incredibly helpful for many of us. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to everybody who's attended today. Everybody have a great rest of your weekend, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.